Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part two as we look at this brief introduction to the Bible and how the Bible is viewed from the perspective of a historian. Well, there's one more thing to look at with the brief introduction to the Bible, and that's going to be looking at two methods of understanding biblical inerrancy. And of course, the word inerrancy refers to without error. And something to point out here, viewing any text as being without error is within the realm of faith. But because so many individuals do hold that these texts are inerrant, I thought it would be important to mention these two understandings of biblical inerrancy, and I'm going to bring them both in together and then give an example. But the first is literal. Well, literal inerrancy holds that the Bible is inerrant in all aspects, but only in the autographs or first editions, which of course we do not have. We do not have any autographs or first editions of any of the books of the Bible. We only have copies. But then the other is contextual. Well, contextual inerrancy holds that on issues relating to salvation, the Bible is inerrant, but that you can find mistakes in terms of history, grammar, science, etc. Okay, let me give an example of these two. And this comes from an interview with Bart Ehrman. And this issue, I would say, is one of the issues that caused Ehrman to lose his faith. Bart Ehrman, just to say, he's one of the best New Testament historians around. I don't always agree with him on all points, but he's a very good New Testament historian. But he's not a Christian. He identifies as an agnostic atheist. And this was one issue that I think got to him and led to him to that point, even though the issue of theodicy, the problem of evil, was ultimately the final straw. Anyway, well, he talked about the story in the Gospel of Mark that deals with picking grain on the Sabbath, where when the followers of Jesus were picking grain on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders, in this case the Pharisees, confronted Jesus and said, "Hey, why are your disciples picking grain on the Sabbath, which is working on the Sabbath, and of course is violating the Sabbath?" And Jesus responded back, "Well, didn't you know how when David was king and Abiathar was high priest, etc., etc.?" But the overall point in his response was that the actions of his disciples was okay. Well, Ehrman focused on one particular issue. If you look at where this story derives from in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel, it is not Abiathar who was the high priest. Rather, it was his father, Ahimelech. Now, who the high priest actually was in the story is really a minor issue. It could have been Caiaphas, who was the high priest during Jesus' lifetime, and it would not have changed the overall point of the story that the action of Jesus' disciples was okay. Well, Ehrman, when he was at Princeton, he wrote this 30-page paper where he argued that Abiathar was really Ahimelech. And he mentioned that the professor that he had was a very pious Christian and was probably sympathetic to him because he's trying to maintain this literal view of Scripture, but he's got the evidence right in front of him showing that that's not the case. So, in any case, the professor gave him an A on the paper, but at the end of the paper, he wrote this one simple statement. He wrote, "Maybe Mark just made a mistake." And Ehrman was like, well, that would have saved me 30 pages worth of writing if I had come to that conclusion. Well, okay, here's how that example from Mark, from the Gospel of Mark, would fit in with contextual and literal. The contextual side would state that, yeah, Mark just made a mistake because who the high priest was doesn't really matter in the overall point of the story. Whereas the literal side would argue that no, Mark didn't make a mistake, but somebody who copied him made a mistake for whatever reason. That's the way of understanding the two different methods of biblical inerrancy, the literal and the contextual. And there's others that could be given, but that's just, one example. So moving forward now, kind of turning to the Bible from the perspective of a historian. Well, one of the first things to understand is that a person does not have to, you know, personally believe in the contents of these books to appreciate them and understand them. When I've taught courses like this in the past, I've had students that have gotten defensive, and I think it's because, simply put, they didn't like what I was talking about, discussing. And I remember one made the statement along the lines how that if you don't personally believe in the Bible, you can't understand it. Okay. Well, during that same interview that I mentioned with Bart Ehrman, um, the person asked him, does it ever come up, in your classes or whatnot about the fact that you personally don't believe in the contents, of the Bible, that, you're not a Christian, etc. And Ehrman's like, yeah, I get that occasionally. Just to say a little something with Ehrman on that, Ehrman, he identifies as an agnostic atheist. Ultimately, the issue that got to him was theodicy, the problem of evil, where he just gave up his Christian faith and identified as an agnostic atheist. Agnostic in the sense, as he put it, he can't say that there's not a God, but atheist in the sense that he doesn't believe in one. Okay. In any case, he was asked, does it ever come up in your classes that, you don't personally believe in the contents of these books? And Ehrman responded, yeah, I get that occasionally. And then, the following question was, what's your response? And Ehrman replied, well, it's all part of our culture. I mean, whether I personally believe, in the contents of these books or not doesn't change that. And then he added how, my wife, um, she teaches, English and teaches Shakespeare, and she personally doesn't believe in him, that kind of thing. Or to go a little bit further, and obviously, you can't raise your hands while I'm asking this question. But let's say that I asked you, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in disembodied people? I'm sure that there are some of you that would not raise your hands to that question. So, okay, you don't believe in ghosts. You don't believe in disembodied people. Does that mean that you cannot appreciate or understand a story which features ghosts? Does that mean that you cannot appreciate or understand Shakespeare's Hamlet, or Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, or Dickens' A Christmas Carol, all of which feature ghosts, just because you don't personally believe there are disembodied spirits? I would say that the answer to that question is no. I would say that you could understand um, Hamlet or Julius Caesar or A Christmas Carol, even though you don't personally believe that there are ghosts slash spirits. Same thing with the Bible. Another notion here. Because this class is being taught from the perspective of a historian, it can certainly lead to where history and faith will collide. Essentially, looking at it from a perspective of history, we are following the pattern set forward by Herodias, the father of history, the ancient Greek scholar. And the thing that Herodias did that set the scene here is, you would have people that would mention how, like, particular events, the gods caused this or the gods did this, where Herodias is like, well, we can't actually prove that. We don't know if the gods decided to do anything here. So let's look at what we can prove. What's in harmony with the natural world. Um, to give an example of that, if you were to ask me, is the belief in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, of Jesus Christ, historic? Because the word belief was used in the question, the answer would be yes, because that belief was held very early on. But if you were to ask me as a historian, did the resurrection of Jesus happen? I can't, as a historian, answer you in the same way. And there are three main reasons why. The first is it's a violation of the natural world. Dead people don't come back. The second is because sometimes people missee and misinterpret various things and events. And the third is that, well, sometimes people just lie. Now, I can say that plenty of historians do believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I do. But I do so in my role as a believer, as a Christian. You know, I will admit, I do kind of wonder sometimes if what the early followers of Jesus experienced is what has come down, as traditional Christian theology. I have wondered that, but regardless of which, I think they experienced something. I don't hold that they made it up. But in any case, like I said, do I personally believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Yes. But I'm saying that as, as a believer, as a Christian. Can I prove the resurrection of Jesus? No. I can't prove it. And the reason why I can't prove it is because of the reasons described previously. I mean, I can state why I believe it, but I can't actually prove it. Well, I think that we will stop here, and then when we continue on, we will look more at the Bible from the perspective of a historian. So I will symbolically see you then.